quote from William Cooper during his very famous 1989 speech. It is learned and it has been known that aliens have been manipulating humankind through secret societies, witchcraft, magic, the occult, and religion.
Hey friends, Sean from SGTReport.com here. This interview is brought to you by our friends at GreenMed. Now listen to this. Medical marijuana sales, guys, are projected to grow from $4.7 billion to $13.3 billion by 2020. And because of the overreach of the federal government, dispensaries have to deal in cash, which is very unsafe. So what is GreenMed? GreenMed is the world's first ERC-20 Ethereum token-backed application enabling customers to purchase legal marijuana using their debit or credit cards. And the pre-ICO is coming up starting September 4th, and you'll get bonuses based on how quickly you act. 40% bonus for the first week during the ICO, drops to a 30% bonus in the second week, and so forth. And in the meantime, to get more information about GRMD and the upcoming ICO, visit greenmed.io. Now let's turn our attention to Brad Olsen. He's an author of the books Modern Esoteric, Beyond Our Senses, Future Esoteric, The Unseen Realms, which is about ETs and the secret state, and he's working on a third book in the series called Beyond Esoteric. He is a very interesting and insightful author, and it's my pleasure to welcome him now. Brad, how are you?
Hey, Sean, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the SGT Report.
Hey, well, I really appreciate you coming on. And let me ask you this. I know that you gave a speech not too long ago about geoengineering. You've been to a lot of these conferences where you speak out on a variety of, I guess what we can call occult subjects, occult meaning hidden. And I want to ask you about Hurricane Harvey. What we see going on in Houston, the devastation we see going on is really unprecedented. And, you know, I was listening to one of your speeches in which you talk about the government testing on civilian populations without announcing it. These are secret tests. You mentioned the Tuskegee experiment where they gave black men syphilis just so they could see what would happen. I want to read this to you. This is from August 15th from TheVerge.com. Why NASA is sending bacteria into the sky on balloons during the eclipse. They claim it has to do with life on Mars. Of course, it's always in the name of doing studies. I'm concerned about the hurricane in Houston because it's doing such incredible widespread damage. And Brad, there's been lots of videos done about how that hurricane may have been created or steered to sit right over where it's sitting for so long. Your thoughts on any of that before we discuss your books?
Steered and parked and 49 inches and counting at this point, Sean. It's looking like one of the greatest disasters, at least since Katrina. And of course, with Katrina, there's quite a bit of talk that that too was steered into New Orleans. It just begs the question, how much longer do we have to deal with these geoengineering experiments? A, before there's disclosure that they're going on, and B, how much destruction must we go through?
And who do you think is funding the ocean-based, sea-based silver lining project, water vapor generating machines to create this artificial weather? None other than Mr. Bill Gates. This is an article back from 2010. So this has been going on for a long time, folks. Technology is way advanced from where we are and what we think about technology.
Now, I'm just back from a 10-day trip. I haven't read too much about it yet, so I'm not going to speak definitively that this is another geoengineering event, but I would say it's awfully suspicious considering that Texas has a lot of militias, armed citizenry, and we're coming into this period where there's going to be a big budget debate whether the government's going to shut down or not. And if there was one state to cripple and bring to its knees, it would probably be Texas. So it's suspect on many different levels, but that one I find intriguing.
Yeah, that's an interesting view on it. And I've heard you talk before about fascism versus neo-fascism. And I thought what you said was really interesting. I talk about fascism a lot, which the classic definition of which is when corporations get in bed with the government, and essentially the corporations take over the government. And you noted that neo-fascism is when the heads of corporations take over the government. And I find that really enlightening because it is the next step, it is the next phase, and it is what we're seeing. We see Google changing its algorithms. As Sundar Pichai says, there is no room at Google for fake news. So now they're the arbiters on everything. It's not up for the people to use their critical thinking skills to decide. Google will decide for you. We see the revolving door of fascism at the FDA, at the FCC with the 5G rollout. I like your definition. When the heads of corporations take over government, it's neo-fascism, and that's what we're suffering under now, isn't it?
It sure is, and that's going to be a whole section in my next book, Beyond Esoteric, because people really have to understand the definition of the word. Do you know since the year 2000, around then, all dictionaries have taken out all mention of corporatism, corporate power, heads of corporation being in this fascist definition. You just can't find them. They're not there anymore. If you have an older dictionary, you can still read about it. But when we were kids, Sean, we learned about Mussolini and Hitler. In fact, Mussolini even coined the term fascism. And that was when heads of government took over corporations to do their bidding. Now we have heads of corporation who have basically seized government through control of the Federal Reserve and other means, and this is a new form of fascism. I think the whole Antifa movement is more or less a distraction, trying to keep us focused on a different subject, when right now what we should be doing is protesting in front of the IRS, protesting in front of the Federal Reserve. Tearing down the Georgia Guidestones is the real threat to the American people, instead of these misguided protests and anger, largely fanning the flames of discontent through the media.
Yeah, interesting. Antifa, really sponsored by George Soros, right? And you make another good point. Instead of tearing down statues, you're right, they should probably be focusing on the Georgia Guidestones, which makes the claim that humanity should be kept in perpetual balance with nature at 500 million. If there's 6.5 billion of us now, that's a pretty drastic population reduction.
Well, they're admitting it right out in the open that the population needs to be drastically reduced by about 90%. That doesn't bode well for you and I, or about 90% of all your listeners, unless they happen to be a billionaire and can burrow underground in some of these bunkers that have been built, or possibly blast off and do the alternative 3, which is populate outside of the Earth on other planets or in space stations.
They make movies telling us that that's what they're planning to do. Elysium comes to mind, and others. But let's talk about your books. Tell us briefly about Modern Esoteric Beyond Our Senses, your first book, and then let's talk about the subjects too in your second book, Future Esoteric, The Unseen Realms. What inspired you to write these books? And by the way, thank you for sending them to me. And then tell us about the third book. What's inspired you to write this latest one, Beyond Esoteric?
Sure. Well, the whole word esoteric means subject matter that is selected by a few people who understand what it's all about. The entire concept of what an esoteric subject is actually changes to a different word, exoteric, when it's adapted by the general population. Now, flat earthers aside, the general concept of the Earth being a globe was picked up in the Age of Enlightenment by an esoteric few, and then by the time we were school children was then accepted by the vast majority of people, making it an exoteric subject. It's kind of funny that it's gone the quite opposite way, but that's a whole other story, and I don't even want to talk about the flat Earth. But esoteric subjects are basically those that have been squandered away, that do not receive any media or government attention. That doesn't mean they're not dealing in those subjects, but they're there nonetheless. And I've always felt that people have a right to know. I came out of being a travel writer. I still do some journalism and go on press trips now and again, but I had been a travel writer, travel book author for about 15 years. But the internet basically decimated the travel book market. So about 10 years ago, I had a bit of an existential crisis figuring out what I'm going to do as a publisher, as an author, how I'm going to continue CCC publishing my business. And it occurred to me that I should just follow my heart and cover these subjects, which I find so near and dear to me. And I'm such a curious thinker. I just wanted to get to the bottom of it for my own sake. And then I just put pen to paper, started writing them up, and what became one book now became a series of 3. Modern esoteric starts at the very beginning with the antediluvian civilization, moves up through primitive wisdom into the mystery schools of old, into the secret societies, and as you said, the occult, which is the literal meaning is hidden, very similar to the word esoteric. And this was the book that basically focuses on where we've been up to this modern age, including many of the trials and tribulations we're dealing with today. Whereas Future Esoteric takes a forward-looking view, it delves into the secret state, how all this very high technology could have been squandered and basically held together by a secret government, which is now going into the aerospace, into private hands, into this corporate government, corporatism, who basically controls much of the high technology that has been derived for 70 years from the time of Roswell to this very day into these special access programs, these highly compartmentalized programs that basically deal with so many of these subjects, which I break into chapters because they're so important.
Well, that's interesting. I think that the deep state in the secret space programs, the breakaway civilization, as Catherine Austin Fitts and Joseph P. Farrell have often talked about, is definitely something that is interesting to our audience. And I know you sort of get into that in Future Esoteric, the Unseen Realms. You talk about ETs, you talk about the secret state. What do you think the reality is in terms of the missing trillions from the Pentagon, in terms of what NASA is really up to? Can we believe anything at all that NASA tells us, number one? And number two, is NASA just cover for what's really going on at Lockheed Skunk Works and some of these other deep state contractors?
I think you hit the nail on the head right there, Sean. NASA, never a straight answer acronym, has been quite that it's a cover for the Naval Space Program, which has been working in tandem for decades, really harnessing some of this greatest technology that has been backward engineered. And NASA, what? No, they can't go into outer space. Oh, we just don't have the technology or the money. We can't build the next generation after the space shuttle. We'll have to rely on the Russians. It's a cover
and now
story.
They're saying, they're saying that they lost the technology, all right? The Apollo technology, they lost it. They're literally saying, we don't have it anymore. We've lost it. We couldn't possibly do it again because all that technology, all of the telemetry data, everything of value is gone. We lost it. NASA themselves says we no longer have the technology to go to the moon.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
They don't even have a cover story for their cover story anymore. That whole thing has been falling apart as it pertains to the Apollo missions.
It sure is falling apart. And you mentioned the missing trillions. Well, back in the 1950s, they did several studies about how, if the planet dies or if we go into World War III, how the elite are going to survive, or how we're going to deal with holes in the ozone and so forth. And alternative one, I'm going to cover this in my third book too, was to blast holes in the atmosphere to allow the ozone to release. Well, that was quickly scrapped and partially done, but not really effective whatsoever. It just created more problems. But alternative two was to burrow underground, to create these underground cities and underground bases. They're called deep underground military bases. And I know you've had Richard Sauter on, who's just a mastermind of this kind of information about what's going on underground. That's where many of the trillions went, but also into the secret space program. And I would go so far as to take a page out of Richard Dolan's playbook, a friend of mine, also a UFO historian, to say that there's even a breakaway civilization of humans living off planet at this point right now. That's pretty mind-blowing when you put it in the context of primitive tribes that still live in the Amazon basin and Papua New Guinea, that we still have Stone Age humans on this planet, as well as a breakaway civilization that have migrated off planet. It's one heck of a time to be alive, Sean, and witness all this that's happening for the better and for the worse.
Well, it sure is. I mean, to say we live in interesting times, we live in scary, perilous times too, because of the constant war drums being beaten by the mainstream media in service of the deep state, and people are getting really worn out by it. Let me ask you this. There is, as it pertains to human beings living off planet right now, Gary McKinnon was the famous hacker who apparently got into the NASA database. And what gives that whole story a lot of credence is how this government went out of its way to try to prosecute this young man who apparently was on the autism spectrum and suffered from being on the spectrum, but he was very bright. He was able to apparently hack into the NASA database, where he says he found a list of non-terrestrial officers.
And I found an Excel spreadsheet that was actually called, or at least in the heading of the column, it said non-terrestrial officers. And I was like, my bloody God, that's just
non-terrestrial officers.
Non-terrestrial officers with ranks and names, and then a separate sheet with tabs for material transfer between ships.
So, what do you make of that whole story, and is that what you're sort of driving at when you say human beings living off planet?
As well as the breakaway civilization, yeah. If there are officers, so just a little more context on Gary McKinnon, and I do cover him in my book, Future Esoteric. He was this, I believe his proper, his symptom is Asperger's.
Yeah, Asperger's,
and
right.
It's a form of autism, so you're pretty correct there. He's just a brilliant computer guy, but he's socially awkward. You can watch videos of him. And for over a decade, the USA wanted to extradite him very badly and was putting a lot of pressure on the British Home Office, who finally just about 2 years ago said, we're not going to do it. Only after very famous musicians like Chrissie Hynde and David Gilmour of Pink Floyd and Bob Geldof and others started playing concerts on behalf of Gary McKinnon not to have him extradited, because it would be the same thing of many of these other whistleblowers. He'd go to a military court, they'd convict him and send him to the jail for many decades, probably, essentially the rest of his life. But the important thing is what he revealed, and he came up with not only these non-terrestrial officers, but he was talking about different ships called, with the distinction USSS, 3 S's, and it's believed that stands for United States Spaceship. Hillentalker, some were like this gentleman named after some of the original MK Ultra, no, I'm sorry, not MK Ultra, the MJ-12 original staff, the USSS Limay, of some of these individuals who are part of the original MJ-12. So this shows that this does go back quite many decades ago to the 1950s or so, that this secret space program has been building to the point where in the year 2000, when Gary McKinnon got into the Johnson Space Center database, he was also finding quite a few edited and unedited photos of not only spacecraft, such as cigar-shaped craft with geodesic domes on them, but also imagery of other craft out in space and some unedited images of the moon showing some bases there, as well as what they're doing, excavating and moving things around. Here's a little tidbit that I have in Future Esoteric you may not have gotten into when you read the book quite yet, but there is no government-sponsored telescope that will allow you to focus in on the moon. We have the technology to look and see the exact footprints laid down by Neil Armstrong in that section of the moon where they landed, or go all over the place to these highly suspect craters that show these illuminating lights coming from them, or structures on the moon. You can't do it. You cannot go to the Palomar telescope or any of them on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. They won't let you focus on the moon. So that's very interesting in and of itself. But the fact that the moon has been a base, especially on the far side, the dark side of the moon, which we can never see, is also very telling, as well as what some of the Apollo astronauts spoke of when they flew around the backside. They had code words for the ET bases. They called it Santa Claus. And why would they be talking about Santa Claus or seeing Santa Claus? But now we know that that was a code word for some kind of alien base or alien presence.
Well, that is puzzling too, because that's where this story gets really complicated, because I tend to agree with you that there's more questions than answers about whether or not we really set foot on the moon. I mean, Wernher von Braun himself said it couldn't be done with the technology that they had. And, I'll tell you what, as it pertains to those moon landings, one of the things that I find to be one of the biggest elephants in the room that is never discussed is why or how, but why would they bother trying to bring a dune buggy to the moon when it was going to be challenging enough to get 3 men safely to the moon and back? Suddenly they think it's a great idea to bring a dune buggy, offload a dune buggy, drive around in a dune buggy. It's the most preposterous thing I can imagine. Can you even imagine the meetings in which the pitch was made, we need to bring a dune buggy? Sure, let's bring the dune buggy, because that makes perfect sense when we're doing something that we've never done before and probably can't be done. We'll bring the dune buggy. But then you mentioned Santa Claus and the trip around the backside of the moon, which makes the leap that they did actually get there. What do you think is the truth? And I didn't even really want to go down this rabbit hole with you about these moon landings, but again, they say they lost all the telemetry data.
I haven't seen anything that indicates the telemetry data is even in existence, and as I said, even if we had it, we don't have the machines to play it back.
But your own research has shown the telemetry data is missing.
That's right.
I just think the whole story is absolutely suspect.
It is indeed, and there are big, thick books, one called The Dark Moon, hundreds of pages showing the photographs released by NASA during the Apollo missions, showing 2 light sources, which is absolutely impossible. You'll never see a sky filled with stars, because then you could pinpoint exactly where that photo was taken from. You have things like the flag waving in a very low gravity with no wind environment. So many things that are suspect, Sean. And as you mentioned, the dune buggy or footage of the capsule taking off from the moon and the camera going up and following it. Well, who's shooting that photo? They leave someone behind?
Right.
They didn't quite have that technology to relay that kind of data in the late 60s.
NASA says it was a remote-controlled camera, which, makes perfect sense. I mean, we can remotely control the camera from Earth, even though you know as well as I do that even when they were doing testing, they had a hard time communicating between NASA and the platform from which the rockets were going to be launched. Sometimes they would lose communications right there on Earth itself. So we're asked to take the leap of faith that that was a remotely controlled camera. Everything went off without a hitch.
Of course, right at the same time, you have Stanley Kubrick filming 2001 and Space Odyssey in a sound studio in London, the most high-tech, realistic lunar environment ever created. And keep in mind, in that movie, they go to an underground base on the moon. They show features on the moon that are forbidden to be talked about or looked at in a telescope to this day. So the thinking is that Kubrick had created many of these images, movies, stills, submitted them to NASA. I do believe they went to the moon. I do believe we landed on the moon. I believe the secret space program is far more developed than anyone can give it credit for. But maybe as a hedge, they had the photos. They said, wow, the pictures we got were pretty crap compared to these Kubrick ones. Why don't we just release them together? I had an opportunity to actually hang out with Buzz Aldrin at a travel show about 15 years ago. I just kind of shadowed him for a while, hoping to catch a couple words with him, and I did. And I said, Buzz, I'm really interested about your return trip. There was many stories of orbs coming to the capsule and possibly even entering the capsule. He turned to me with those steely blue eyes and he gave me that look. I was almost thinking, don't slug me, man. But he didn't say a thing. He didn't confirm or deny, but he just gave me that look like, how did you know that? And then he basically, after that, was, I'm done with you. And ditch me. But I found that to be very telling that he did not say, "Oh, come on, that's ridiculous." He didn't deny it, but he just gave me that look like, "Wow, you know something about this mission that not many people know about." And that is one of the greatest mysteries, is how much contact they may have actually had on that mission. Not only the very first one to land on the moon, but other Apollo missions. We're talking about ETs just over the horizon, craft, even entities themselves that they think they may have seen. And of course, the orbs. The orbs were a common feature in most all of the Apollo missions. There is one astronaut named Edgar Mitchell who was very outspoken before he died, and he said flat out, yes, of course, we were visited not only on that mission, but here on Earth for thousands of years. So this is the grand subject, Sean. This is really the meat and potatoes of conspiracy research, because it is so vitally important if people were to spend the time and get into it. In fact, they did a study with scientists, astrophysicists, and so forth, who came into the field not knowing anything. We're basically atheists on the subject of ufology. And the more they learned, this is what the study found, the more they learned, the more intrigued they were, and the more they would say, this is something worthy of further investigation. Pretty much across the board, everybody that was involved in that study, the big brains at our universities and NASA who do this kind of thing, admitted that there is something very worthy of study here. And I would have to agree. And this is pre-disclosure time. This is the period where it really matters who is studying this stuff, because it is so vitally important. And I do believe in future generations are going to look back and say, who cared about this? Who is making a stink? Who is saying we need to know this information? And I would agree that this is vitally the most important subject matter that we could grok and try to understand, because it really will shape our future and certainly our present.
All right. Now, before we let you go here, we've really gone down a rabbit hole, so I'd be remiss not to mention the occult background or history of NASA. Jack Parsons, I think he was over at JPL. But the occult roots of all of this stuff begs the question, are some of these ETs, are all of these ETs spiritual in nature, meaning are they actual biological entities, or have these people engaged in communicating with spirit entities? This is your area of expertise, right? This is the unseen realms.
That's it exactly.
I guess I'm asking, are they actual aliens from other civilizations, or is this some sort of spiritual entity? Are these demonic entities, at least in part or in whole?
That's a great question, Sean. I'm glad you're interested in this subject. It is basically as complicated as it would be to explain the 13 dimensions that science says we live in. But basically, on the fourth dimensional realm, which we can only catch very brief glimpses of in our dense third dimensional reality, that is the realm of the tricksters, the jinn, the spirits. You could even go so far as to say even some of the fantasy creatures from folklore, such as leprechauns or gnomes or other entities that can appear and then disappear, maybe even Bigfoot. But then there are malevolent ETs that also exist on this plane, such as the gray aliens, such as the reptilians. They have made a concerted decision not to evolve to the fifth dimension. And when you get to the fifth dimension, then you have what in the 19th century were called the etheric beings, these beings of light that do not necessarily have to take a physical body, especially up in the seventh and beyond dimensions. They're just beings of light, what we might call angels, which have been reported to have visited humans for thousands of years. So people can get bogged down on what they look like or who they are, but I've always said the most important thing is, what is their intention? Are they in service to self, such as some of the benevolent beings that want to see us evolve, or are they in service to themselves? So it's service to others or service to self. And if they're in service to self, then they're the ones who are doing the abductions, the cattle mutilations, and basically keeping a iron grip on the control of this planet. I've often said that the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds are really just the captains and the colonels. The real generals are the ETs, these malevolent ETs, which have fourth dimensional power and which can shadow, they call it, shadow the people that do work with them to do their bidding. That's why there's such a rigid hierarchy in this country and so much centralized control. It's very easy to manipulate that hierarchy. That's what we're dealing with here on Earth. And it's the study called exopolitics. It is learning about what ET groups are having, what influence on Earth, and really who we need to align with and shun to protect ourselves as well.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, guys, this is probably why you're going to want to buy these books: Modern Esoteric, Beyond Our Senses, Future Esoteric, The Unseen Realms. And Brad, when does the third book come out?
I'm working on it currently, and it's looking like a 2019 release. It's about 3/4. I've got all the chapters worked out. I've got the whole structure. I just need to fill in some gaps and get to work with my editors and finish it up. But probably about 18 months from now, Sean.
All right. Well, I hope you're willing to come on again, because I think we've just scratched the surface here, because I tend to agree with you here. I think the conclusions I've drawn, given my research and all the interviews I've done, is that we are engaged on this planet in spiritual warfare. And you mentioned the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. It seems really clear, given the testimony of Ronald Bernard and so many others, that the people at the top of the pyramid do worship a very dark power that they believe gives them power in this realm. In fact, just to put a name on it, they worship Satan or Lucifer and are willing to do sacrifices to that entity in order to gain power. So at the end of the day, I really do think that is our number one problem on this planet. If people want to know why there's famine, if people want to know why there's endless war, if people want to know why we cannot live in peace with one another, and why these people are always trying to divide and conquer us, it's because they are engaged against us in spiritual warfare.
You nailed it on the head once again, Sean. You're very versed in this subject. I would just like to end with a quote from William Cooper during his very famous 1989 speech at the UFO Congress. It's still online. You can watch it on YouTube. I highly recommend everybody to watch it. And at one point he says, "It is learned and it has been known that aliens have been manipulating humankind through secret societies, witchcraft, magic, the occult, and religion." So when you think about all those entities also having this malevolent ET influence, it starts to all come together. And another quote he said I love so much is, "You put the aliens in the middle of this stuff and you get all the answers." And it's kind of true.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at in the world today.
All right, and tell people the best way to get the books.
Well, please visit my website, www.cccpublishing.com. That's 3 C's in publishing, one word. You'll see my books as well as Leo Lion-Zagami's and other authors that we've published. And if sales go through the website, at least if they're my books, I'm able to sign them on the way out through our office here in San Francisco. If you want to learn more about me or my upcoming radio show called The Esoteric Circle, please visit bradolsen.com. That's BRADOLSEN. And my YouTube channel is called The Esoteric Series.
All right, very good. Yeah, guys, check out the YouTube channel and be sure to subscribe to Esoteric Series. Our guest has been Brad Olsen. Brad, thanks so much. I really do appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you, Sean. And I do look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Yeah, me too. And guys, thank you so much for tuning in. We very much appreciate it. Check us out at the new and improved mobile-friendly sgtreport.com and thelibertymill.com for real news 24/7. God bless y'all. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
This country has a vicious, corrupt core. And the most vicious, corrupt people are sitting in D.C. right now, running the show and forming the media elite and establishment that surrounds and protects them and promulgates their bullshit all over the airways.